Election Day in America.
Donald Trump and Joe Biden have made their final pitches to voters.
Winning.
I'm going to be an American president.
Americans have shown they want their voices heard with record numbers of pre-polling.
They've had 4 years to think about it, with another 4 now at stake.
Just minutes away from the first results.
I get everyone's attention again.
Things are neck and neck.
It's certainly going to be a long, long day and night.
The US presidential election is hanging in the balance, where the results may not be known for days.
The results in key swing states are not yet known.
We are now headlong into what could be a contested ballot.
The nightmare scenario that many feared, that things would be so tight and then you would have Donald Trump doing what he's just done.
This is a fraud on the American public. Frankly, we did win this election.
And it ain't over till every vote is counted. Every ballot is counted.
I'm not a participant in the US political process. I am a partner.
Democracy is too important for it to be undermined by any individual.
What we're seeing now is not including the early vote. And the early vote is the one that Democrats feel the most confident about.
They're trying to steal an election.
We respect the decisions that the American people make in their democracy.
After 4 long, tense days, we've reached a historic moment in this election.
The Fox News decision desk can now project that former Vice President Joe Biden will win.
Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, will be denied a second term.
My fellow Americans, I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but unify.
Members on my right, members on my left, members on both sides. Mr. Speaker.
Time has concluded.
Federal politicians have returned to the capital this week, but most are keeping at least one eye on developments across the Pacific. The victory of Joe Biden over Donald Trump is the biggest story in the world right now.
The US election was meant to be one day and it became a week, and it really dominated Australian politics in many ways as to what that election would mean to what the debate becomes here within Australia, and we finally got an outcome.
Oh, it was an agonising wait, wasn't it? I mean, Australia, like the rest of the world, had been bated breath wondering who's going to win. But you got the very distinct impression from a Conservative Australian PM that he was mightily relieved that a Democrat candidate should have won the US presidency.
And he was out there quickly congratulating Joe Biden, which was sending a signal of some description.
Certainly, it was clear, I think, that the Australian government was seeing this as a potential administration that they'll be able to work with. And even though the Prime Minister was saying publicly that he had a great relationship with Donald Trump, I think there is a clear sign within the government that they are relieved they're working with an administration that they can have a more predictable engagement with, the first phone call being an example of that.
Well, Mr. President-elect, congratulations, and also to Vice President-elect Kamala Harris on your election.
So when Scott Morrison came out at Kirribilli Sunday morning, he knew that very few world leaders had actually congratulated Joe Biden on camera. It was him, it was Macron, and it was Frank Bainimarama. So he had to go out and speak effectively on behalf of the Western world. So when he went out at the Kirribilli to congratulate Joe Biden, he said, I, among other world leaders, would like to congratulate him. Now, I think that says a lot about the deep anxiety that the Western world, America's usual allies, has about this interregnum, the period between the election day and inauguration.
Tonight on Four Corners, we go inside the Canberra bubble.
There are lots of developments in Canberra following a Four Corners investigation.
Attorney General Christian Porter has rejected key elements of a Four Corners report that has exposed the seedy side of politics in the nation's parliament.
And that culture, you will all know, is not restricted to government or opposition, to Labor or Liberal, or frankly the media.
In the wake of the Four Corners episode, what we were trying to achieve was to set the context around why is it in the public interest when politicians have these sex scandals? And I think we sort of arrived at 3 criteria where it can be in the public interest.
Moral hypocrisy. You're doing it on the taxpayer purse, and finally that you can be compromised in this age where foreign interference has become a thing again. It's a real issue. Now, we were setting up the context for all of those things, but underlying all of what was in the Four Corners program was this question of the culture of Parliament House. What this comes down to, what that toxic culture that they're talking about comes down to, is that people have affairs in offices, and in Parliament House what happens is the minister moves on and the staff, the female staff, basically are frozen out, have their careers terminated in one shape or another. And I think we've seen in the wake of Four Corners' report on Monday night that this is where the story is going. It's about the way women end up. It's not about sexual harassment. It's about what the implications and the costs are for women as opposed to men.
Ms Ruston, can I ask you, as a woman in the government, your reflections on the culture inside? Has it got better, worse, or no change since the bonk ban era?
Well, Phil, the only thing that I can...
How this ban is referred to, I think, is quite dismissive of the seriousness of the issue, Phil. And I would ask media to stop referring to it in that way. We took it very seriously. And I think constantly referring to it in that way dismisses the seriousness of this issue. It's a very serious issue. Thanks, Anne.
Yeah. Well, Phil, I mean, obviously I can only reflect on my own experience.
Within hours of the Four Corners piece coming out, Scott Morrison was out with the Social Services Minister, Anne Ruston. They were there to talk about JobSeeker and the coronavirus supplement, but inadvertently found himself at the heart of this issue that was dominating the Parliament that day.
It was a bad look, and the Prime Minister will say that he was trying to make a point about the use of this phrase, the bonk ban, that the journalist asked about whether or not there was a ban on sex with ministerial staffers and used that terminology. But in the end, that question was directed to Anne Ruston about the culture at Parliament House for women, and he spoke over the top of her and then made another point and then sort of deferred to her. And in the broader kind of really heated debate that's happening at Parliament House in the wake of that program about the culture here, about fairness and safety, women in the workplace, gender equality, that did not go down well with the public.
And the focus initially was on two ministers, but as the week went on, it did become more about that broader treatment, the rights that staffers have and the few rights that they have, and then how they were treated across the political spectrum.
What it means when you have a way of operating as a minister where you have the ability to hire and fire and make calls about who's on your staff, and in a highly charged political environment, the argument has always been made that they need that ability to do that, but we are now seeing how that could potentially be misused or allegedly misused, and that opens up a bigger question about whether or not there needs to be a better human resources procedure in place for people who have a grievance.
There's no doubt that there's a rich story to be told about the political culture inside this building. That said, and this is not Media Watch, Four Corners did also invite the political journalists, those who live in this building, to question what is and what isn't in the public interest. And that's still a very, very live question, even after Four Corners.
Labor frontbencher Joel Fitzgibbon announced he was quitting the shadow cabinet.
This morning I went to see my mate Anthony Albanese and informed him that I was stepping down from the shadow cabinet.
Labor made no secret of the fact that they hoped that a Joe Biden victory would give them a great political attack on the government and to do with climate policies and emissions targets. It then had scandals to start the week with ministerial conduct. And in the end, Labor ended up talking about itself because it couldn't work out what it thought about it.
Yeah, that's right, Brett. You had this confluence of circumstance here that might have helped Labor, be it Four Corners and Joe Biden, and then came Joel, who threw a huge rock into that plan, and he exploded Labor unity on climate change this week.
To win government, we also need to do well here, gas, here, coal, and to pick up sufficient regional seats, you have to be sending the message that Labor wants to take meaningful action on climate change, is not going to leave behind its traditional base.
He is advertising the existential threat that Labor has on climate change policy, one that goes back probably more than a decade, quite frankly, and one that they are struggling to resolve, that bind between the blue-collar worker, the outer metropolitan voter that Labor needs to win government, and then the inner city voter for whom an appeal on climate change policy is much easier.
Do you think that he can win the next election with the policy platform that the Labor Party is likely to send him to the election with, particularly on energy and climate change?
I think Albo can win if he listens to Joel Fitzgibbon more.
So as Four Corners is going to air, Shadow Cabinet is meeting. But what on earth was going on in that meeting room?
Well, an extraordinary chain of events, which many people have been very happy to tell reporters about on both sides, trying to set the record straight. But the sort of, I guess the details seem pretty clear. There was a screaming match between the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, and Joel Fitzgibbon over their disagreement, their long-running disagreement, and how Joel Fitzgibbon's interjections were causing real damage to what Labor thought it could capitalise on. And, you know, it unfolded in such an incredible way.
In fact, Anna, it got so heated between Mark Dreyfus QC and the man who represents coal miners that the Labor Shadow Ministry should be grateful they were socially distanced.
There was a concern that Mark Dreyfus was getting out of his seat and that there could possibly have been a physical altercation.
Why did we not have cameras on that?
Australians are being told to brace for disturbing and brutal findings on alleged war crimes in Afghanistan.
This will be difficult and hard news for Australians, I can assure you. This requires us to deal with honest and brutal truths.
An investigation into the conduct of Australian soldiers was 4 years in the making. The Australian public is going to see part of that next Thursday. The Prime Minister's going to be overseas, which was probably a place where he'd rather be than seeing this report come out.
Well, we know from what's already been said, this is going to be a really troubling report.
Oh, this is going to be a nation-defying moment when the image of the digger is traduced by the actions of the few. I think this is going to be awful for Australia, a nation that's prided itself in its soldiers, its international engagement, and it's going to be deeply embarrassing to the nation as a whole.